Good afternoon. Our next speaker is a native of Edgefield, South Carolina. Drew Lanham is the author of The Home Place, Memoirs of a Colored Man's Love Affair with Nature, which received the Reed Award from the Southern Environmental Law Center and as a Southern Book Prize, and was a finalist for the John Burroughs Medal. He is a birder, a naturalist, a hunter conservationist who has published essays and poetry in publications including Orion, Audubon, Flycatcher, and Wilderness, and in several anthologies including The Color of Nature, State of the Heart, Barton's Living Legacy, and Carolina Writers at Home. An alumni distinguished professor of wildlife ecology and master teacher at Clemson University, he and his family live in the upstate of South Carolina, a soaring hawk's downhill glide from the southern Appalachian escarpment that the Cherokee once called the Blue Wall. Please join me in welcoming our next speaker, Drew Lanham.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you, Natchez Literary Fest. Thank you, everyone there and here in between. It's a unique time, right, that we get to gather in the same place, but distantly. Who could have predicted this? Of course, no one could have. I always go back during these times and think about my grandmother, who was born in 1896, who raised me in many ways, and she used to talk about Judgment Day all the time. And one of the things that she would always say was that on that day, all of our lives would be spread across heaven as if it were a giant screen. So I suppose that maybe this is in some ways what she saw, but in thinking about my grandmother and thinking about my home place and thinking about who I am as a writer, as a professional, as a scientist, all of that for me is linked so much back into my time growing up in Edgefield, which for a lot of people it's kind of it's a mystery as to what Edgefield or where it is. And then I tell them, well, it's Strom Thurmond's birthplace. It's the home of 10 governors in the state of South Carolina. So as much as any small county had to do anything with the formation of these United States, South Carolina, Edgefield, South Carolina, really played a great role. I tell folks that the money in South Carolina in the planter class was down in Charleston, obviously, and in the Low Country. But then in the Piedmont and Edgefield County were a bunch of rabble-rousers, Scots-Irish, who sort of had the political rule of the roost in some ways. Pitchfork Ben Tillman, a former governor and not a good one of South Carolina, not a good one for those of us with black skin anyway. So growing up in a place like that had this sort of political grind against equality and really anyone not landed in white, I'm a black man coming out of a southern county with a love for nature. And so that's what I write about primarily, but I've found in these years and especially the last few years that I've been drawn more and more to trying to connect nature and culture. So I call it, I mean, it's a convergence really between conservation and culture that I sort of center on in my writing. So today I thought that I would share with you really sort of a patchwork quilt. My grandmother was also a quilter. My mom, who is still alive, thankfully, is a quilter. And I remember going in my grandmother's house, the place in the book I call the Ramshackle. And just a few years ago, and finding a bag, the house was falling down everywhere, roof had fallen in many places, but there in her old icebox room was a bag, was a grocery bag, a paper bag full of rolled up pieces of quilt. that had been tied, of course, with another thinner piece of cloth. And my mother was able to take some of those pieces and quilt me a piece, a small blanket out of it. So I like piecemeal. I like taking disparate pieces of things and putting them together for stories. And so I thought I would offer some of that today as we talk about this. You know, how do you wring stories out of these bad times? I mean, my grandmother used to also, she used to have me read out of Revelations all the time. That's partially where I learned to read, and kind of a scary place for a young man, for a boy to learn to read, but it instilled certain things in me, maybe from a mystic's standpoint, sort of taught me who I didn't want to be from a religious standpoint, but then also gave me sort of insight into allegory, right? And thinking about how to bend story from one age to the next across generations, which I think is important as a writer. I mean, we all want to be widely read by lots of folks. And so I try to bring that past that I grew up in, my grandmother's past, that stretched back into the 19th century, trying to bring things forward into the 21st century. So I kind of coded 3 words for my writing, and my friend John Lane and I, who many of you may know, wonderful author and poet, we talk daily about writing, and we are always talking about axes. That is, what are those planes essentially upon which you write? I mean, and these can change. Mine tend to be largely writ, race, place, and nature, right? And so within those, I told John, these days I feel like immediacy, persistence, and purpose are kind of 3 themes that I write to. The immediate situation I try to write to daily in some way, to persist through it as a writer, and to do my best to reflect not just the times, but how I'm feeling about it, how I think it might impact the times to come, but then what we've drugged from the past that may have us in the present situation. And then purpose, to try to have the writing enlarge, to try to have it enlarge who we are, why we are here, why we do what we do, and hopefully leverage the words to some greater good. So I've had a chance to speak at quite a few places in this Zoom universe, and one of the first really sort of COVID related episodes of sharing writing that I had was at a poetics conference, and poetics informs a great deal of what I do as a writer. I'm fortunate in being the current poet laureate of my home county of Edgefield. And so I felt honored to be able to collaborate with Dr. Jamie Reeser and Theodore Richards, 2 of my poet colleagues. So I had written then that COVID-19 is just another crisis in a series of crises visited upon those of us with ethnic preconditions. Black or brown skin is licensed and opening for societal infection, the pestilence of injustices heaped upon bias. We die by acute police brutality, arrest, trial, and execution, by suspicion where we stand, by denial of basic rights, by lack of clean water to drink, starving in food deserts, living on the wrong side of the tracks in a right-wing test tube. We are the lab rats, poked, prodded, given lethal doses of prejudice. James Baldwin said that Negroes should be pissed off at the persistent struggle. I agree. We are to the nation we helped build mostly a disease, socially distanced now for some 400 years, quarantined in separate and unequal boxes with blankets left over from the native purge. We adapted, we vaccinated and immunized ourselves with strength and resilience, and somehow survived all the outbreaks of dark middle passage holes, chains, whips, rape, castration, maiming, murder, lynching ropes, votes discounted, lives choked out, promises thrown away, communities redlined and power gerrymandered. Now this, almost 1 million in the ground, or nearly so. We die in multiples as whiteness suffers in singles, no less saddened in the losses. They add by fingers as our numbers roll past digits on hands and feet, already missing pieces chopped off because of sugar diabetes. Diagnosed with living while Black, it's a chronic condition. Yes, I'll stay at home, first to not infect someone else with myself, but then to not be shot down in the streets while I run. America seeing me as the more dangerous threat. Will the rising seas drown us first if the pandemic of racism doesn't win the race? You see, the crisis for some of us is cast in historic stone, indelibly linked into who we are by the color of our skin. It is not one viral outbreak. It is daily, more than most can ever calculate, more than the talking heads can read or the bottom of the screen tickler can scroll. Life is the immediate thing, and equal chance at living is all we ask. Trouble comes for everyone, late or that right soon. For some, it visits and sits down to stay. Then crisis is no longer something to think of as disrupting normal. It is normal. Take it away. So that's kind of a reflection from early on for me. That's a poem that I wrote back in April or May of last year. So you're thinking of it. I'm seeing it now almost a year removed, and so I'm able to look at my writing as a journal, really, as many of us do. I will admit that I am not a disciplined journal keeper, but I write something almost every day that tracks who I am first, but then how I'm feeling in that particular day. So it is an interesting exercise to go back and look, and even to read that and think. Then you heard me sort of hitch up on 1 million. Back then I had written almost 100,000, and that in itself is telling, right? And often as poetry is performative, and many of us will sort of edit on the fly as we read. It sort of halted me there, because in my mind I'm thinking, wow, in less than a year we've gone from less than 100,000 to over 500,000 souls gone. So that's worthy of talking about my grandmother's plagues. We've had political change, we've had political unrest, we've had peaceful protest, we have had violent protest, we've had all of these things within the span of a year, and yet writers continue to write, artists continue to perform. Life in some ways, though masked, goes on. And so thinking about that as a writer, and thinking about it as a nature writer, as someone who by these axes of race, place, and nature is pulled to writing mostly about birds. I find these days that I don't just write about birds, that I write for birds, and I write to birds, literally, writing letters to the birds, because I feel that maybe they are listening, at least sort of metaphorically, in a way that they can carry messages further than human voice can. So, this question of how do the writer's words, how do the poet's words impact crisis? I ask, how do words and verse, rhymed or not, evenly lined or raggedly torn, help us cope in times of struggle? And you read enough and you'll hear it argued that art is a privilege in times like this, that it's not a necessity, and we see it in many ways with funding cuts and lack of support for the arts in some ways, in many ways. But I argue just the opposite. I argue that it's the necessity we can ill afford to lose in these critical times. I think it's as essential as air or water, as equitable health care, to keep us sane, really. All you've got to do is peel back the layers of time, right, and go back to the caves of Lascaux, and people living in caves, who were being pursued by beasts bigger and hairier than they were, to eat them, who found time, in the caverns of caves to paint, and undoubtedly to sit around and to tell stories of woolly rhinoceroses and dire wolves and those kinds of things. And so art has always been important to us. And I think as we go on and learn more about others, we're going to find out that it's important in some ways, this sort of ability to take one's mind into this creative realm of enjoyment, which includes play, doesn't belong just to us. We know that ravens do that, for example. So I said that the crises for many of us continue to be exacerbated by other crises, from microaggressions to fatal violence openly enacted on public streets, to national trends denoting an entire race as an at-risk status. And so how does that impact my writing? It impacts my writing in ways that leads me, as I watch birds, to think about birds, again, as messengers. And so I think that in these times we have to be vocal. That even as we begin to see what looks like light at the end of the tunnel, we understand that the repercussions for relaxing or not doing what the science tells us to do could literally be deadly for us. So in thinking about that, in thinking about this immediacy, this urgency, and this persistence and this purpose, I write about birds. I write to birds, I write for birds, but I also write about the stress exacted by racism. I write about my experience as being a Black man birding. I write about different places. I write about home, the sort of intensification of being quarantined and having to stay. This time of year, and really throughout the year, I'm frequently traveling doing readings. But now I'm at home, and so what's that like to be at home? And there's a certain privilege that I have, to have a backyard or to have a little place to escape to. Everyone doesn't have that. And so I try to remember that in my writing. And I try to blend the beauty with the bitterness, both historically present and hopefully not for the future, but what we kind of see coming. So there's a little bit more of my grandmother's maybe mysticism and prescience at play. So I say that there's power in our words. There's power in poetics. that we have to use the tools laying in front of us to be immediately loud, to be boisterous, to be bold, to tell our stories however we can, to not wait on the privilege of glossy publication. Now, as a scientist, you know, I made my scientific cred by publishing the data that I had gathered as a researcher, and then co-publishing with graduate students who got out and did the dirty work. And that was how I made my living, my credibility, grew it as a scientist. I think that as writers, we have a little more leverage as nonfiction creative writers. Maybe we have a little more leverage to use the data that we gather on ourselves. So my daily data that I gather on me, on how I'm feeling on that day, that I don't have to wait for publication per se for that word to be spread. I can update status. I can upload Instagram pictures. I can tweet. I can do all of those things that begin to put my ideas out there in the public stream. And I think that's an important thing that we maybe aren't talking enough about, because we obviously, there's so many wonderful places in print. I am, for one, a very tactile person. I love getting a journal with my work in it alongside others, to see my words and to feel my words on that printed page alongside others. But we have to understand where we are now, sort of in space and time, that even as many of those venues, if not have disappeared, have gone to first moving things online, that it's important to think about our purpose. So here again, we write first. I teach my students, we write first for self. That we have to be satisfied with the veracity of what we write, the accuracy of it, but also hopefully the voice that it evokes, that we've been emotive in writing, and evocative, that it becomes evocative in the reading. But then how do we sort of test that? And I think that in some ways, social media can be a crucible for testing the writing that we do. So where I can, I put out little bits and pieces of that there. So I'm going to share now a couple of pieces that I wrote that are more sort of in the direction, and to give some indication of this, really of this convergence that I talk about. Again, as an ornithologist, as a trained ecologist, and somebody with a doctorate in wildlife management, and I still feel an obligation, a heavy obligation, to connect people to nature. But I want to go beyond the ways that people have traditionally connected others to nature, in that I have the capacity of a different lens that shines through my skin. And so that lens through black skin and what nature is I think important and underheard. Not that certainly that I am the first to do it. Many before me now and in the future will do so. But to have the opportunity as an ornithologist and somebody, one of the few trained in that area, who looks sort of like I do, to do that, I feel, again, an obligation to share both the science of the birds, but also sort of the psychology of self, in a way that has people learn something about the birds themselves, but then also maybe learn something about me, but then question the blurring that I do in between. That is what I want to do is purposefully blur lines between a bird's life and mine. Now, part of that grows out of a childhood dream of being a bird. One of the chapters in the home place is called Little Brown Icarus, because I was constantly trying to fly. I never got high enough for the sun to melt the wax and to loose the bindings of my wings. Rather, gravity always won first. So I live vicariously through birds, and that is something that I continue to do. So this next piece that I wrote, that's now going to be a part of this next book, that's called Sparrow Envy, a field guide to birds and lesser beasts, that is being published by my good friends at Hub City in Spartanburg, South Carolina. This is a piece called Lifeless List, and this book, by the way, is really a new book. Well, about 80% of it. Some of it is a little bit of retread from Sparrow Envy, a chapbook that my friend John took a great deal of faith and published at Holocene, his small press, back in 2016. And the book has gone actually through a couple of printings and is pretty hard to find now. So Meg Reed at Hub City took a great interest in it, bought the rights, and now we're working on this beautiful book that should drop on vernal equinox. So I'm looking forward to that first day of spring and Field Guide to Birds and Lesser Beasts being out. This piece that is sort of representative of that that's in a Field Guide to Birds and Lesser Beasts is called Lifeless List. Those of you who are bird watchers or birders recognize the life list, that litany of birds, of species that we've seen throughout our lives. This is a take on that. Lifeless List. Do you know how hard it is to admire plumage on the most beautiful bird? To separate one warbler's chip note from another, or count the telltale hind wing spots on a butterfly? Do you know how hard it is to tell whether the fox's track is of a gray or red, to listen for trill duration of the next door toad, or remember the name of that wildflower, or gather the energy to find the Latin binomial of a beetle in a field guide? Do you know how hard it is to remember whether I'm above or below the Conant and Collins Mason-Dixon line, to know whether the frog in my backyard plastic pond is green or bronze? To understand just how many slimy species split out like taxonomic shrapnel from the glutinosis line, it is not any easier to split differentially textured dorsal hairs, or see rictal bristles, or differences in marginal scutes, or divine the wordiness of semi-permeable skin beasts into the appropriate pigeonholes, or even give a damn what the name of anything is, beyond the last black body that lies still after being hunted down jogging, or knee choked, or shot while sleeping by the police. Beyond the streaming calculus of 500,000 plus suffocated by virulence, it is a lifeless list accruing I'd rather not keep, growing longer hour by hour, lengthening daily. There's little room left in my heart right now for other names. Bird can just be bird. Lizard is just that. For today, at least, just list me, please, alongside as yet somehow human being alive. So there is a piece that really sort of goes almost to an extreme and right to the edge as a scientist, as somebody who's worked with all of these critters, not just birds, but reptiles and amphibians and small mammals and even butterflies during my career, to give some idea of living on this edge between your identity as a human being and that as a naturalist and scientist, and really trying to ply that edge in a way that you're able to do both. So, we talk about in ecology, edges and ecotones as being those especially rich places where many species find survival the easiest, where the sun warms, where fruiting and insects are abundant to feed on, where it's easier to travel. And so I think as I write about what I call an eco-psycho-socio edge, that is, so again, thinking about these axes, these places where I exist. So race, the specific place, and then nature, whether that is birds or lesser beasts. And so this has become a poem that that's sort of like one of those, well, I guess it's like sourdough, right? It's constantly working. There are things, as a matter of fact, this morning, I was working it for a scientific meeting that I attended just a little bit earlier, because part of what I want my peers to see is sort of where I am in this process, that in trying to bring science to this place of recognition and not operating in a silo, to understand that some of us are impacted by life outside of those things that we watch through binoculars or that are singing in the nearby ponds as spring comes upon us. So that again is sort of this coming forward from a year, and even though this poem is something that I've been working on, this is one that's been going now probably for about 4 or 5 months, which is actually for me a little long for a poem. I tend to work pretty quickly, but then I have difficulty in letting poems go. So I'm frequently working it one way or another. I suppose it's with the sourdough analogy, it's kneading it, and maybe I'm kneading it too much, but it is, I work it one way, then I work it the other way, and then at some point, I pinch off some, throw it in the pan, and it turns out like it turns out. But that's a piece that's been important, and I'll frequently have a poem or an essay. I have an essay called Why I Write for Birds that's sort of modeled after Terry Tempest's beautiful essay of her writing declaration, which I think is something that all writers should do, and have that sort of constitution with yourself, that declaration of your work that gives you an idea, again, along those axes of purpose, right? And so it's something that I constantly go back to. So I hope that gives you some idea of sort of that immediacy, so that feeling from the beginning, really, of a poem that really was kind of certainly an Anthropocene poem, and I call the Anthropocene the age of woe. And so you hear the woe in that poem, and you hear woe probably, and as in WOE, and quite a few of my poems, because I end up writing again about race quite a bit. And as I write about race, we know that in America, it really is a third rail. I'm learning just how much of a third rail with this last essay that I just wrote for Audubon magazine on what should we do with John James Audubon. And the response to it has been overwhelmingly positive, but I'm finding out just how much people are in love with the idea of a bird watching hero. And so in thinking about history and thinking about birds and thinking about all of the convergences that that I lived through, I wanted to share just a bit of this piece that of this declaration. And so I said, after sort of this declaration, this longer declaration about birds, I say, a murmuration becomes a sudden meditation. A call from a plover is alms. There is this melding of realities that cause me to lose track of responsibility and time. When I watch birds, it is often a selfish act in small personal space that I do not always willingly share with other humans. That might be wrong-hearted, but it is who I have become, an introverted ornithologist codependent on this ornithotherapy that the birds give without cost. But I gladly pay anyway. Knowledge is power, and the more I understand the interactions between earth and sky and birds and us, the better armed I become to defend the soil and water on which we all depend. I pay with my attention and I pay with my time. I pay by becoming more familiar with birds than a cataloging of numbers seen will ever show. Yes, I know birds by chips and churs and self-harmonizing sonata. I know birds by the flash of red and gold epaulet. I know birds by miraculous journeys spanned across watery gulfs and landscapes lain desolate by development. I know them by the way they launch themselves into the air on a faith absent worshiping any gods except lift and thrust. I know them by home, by my native southern Piedmont fragmented into jigsaw pieces, by Blue Ridge hanging on to what's left of wildness, by low country salt marsh pluff mud stinking so good of sulfur. I know them by places far away, the tundra swan winging through moonlight in the Ace Basin, going back to some Arctic realm, by the handful of less than an ounce of feathers surviving predator and destructive perversion, the warbler back in spring to perch itself in my fortunate view, to grace my puny ground-tethered existence here. The difficulty in my watching is the ever-degrading context that makes the joy sometimes insular. I'm grieving loss and losing ground in all this mourning. I watch from an island surrounded by a world that seems ever to be falling down in pieces around me. Birds are an escape sometimes, but ignoring the sea rising, no matter how grim, is the sin. And so as I write to beauty, I must also write daily to the toxic streams of news that pass through my mental binocular view. I must write to violence. I must write to the news of wars and rumors of wars. I must write to racial injustice. I must write to hashtag movements. It is the socio-politically fragmented and climate-inflamed Anthropocene landscape over which we are all migrating and so cannot be ignored. To write about birds and not about their struggles would be akin to writing about Black people as if enslavement and Jim Crow and police brutality and mass incarceration and police murders never existed. That I have stake in two worlds that converge at my oneness is best blessing and worst curse. Both suffering and celebration fall each moment to me. My Black life matters most to me, and I won't deny my own soul's well-being to make birds small and just something to be seen without deeper connection and feeling. And so I write about birds because they are my last best hope for heaven's angels here on earth, or whatever sublime unearthly things, nirvana or brigadoon, or any alleged paradise I could ever pray for beyond the existence I know might behold, beyond the fated disappointment of humans who fail in loving consistently. Birds do not. I ask nothing of them, and they give everything. There is no morning song I ever wish the cardinal had undone, or promise of inspiring, or nest dream weaving any wren has ever broken or fallen short of. The only possible way for birds to fail me is if they cease to be. For that reason alone, I must work to make sure that such a thing does not happen. I cannot watch a red-tailed hawk hang high on the wind and think lowly. I cannot hear the chirps of migrants in nighttime transit over my drowsy head and ever fail to wonder how miraculously intrepid the tiny flighted travelers are. I cannot witness masses of European starlings murmurating, see the unified waves of sweeping, undulating, turning, twisting, climbing, diving, wing on wing, rubbing, rustling storms of flocking birds, and think of them as invasives that don't belong. I cannot see a skein of Canada geese honking to some wild heaven as they slide across the face of a waxing October gibbous and not have a tear crease the corner of my eye just because they ruined your ninth hole putt and are unworthy of pause or consideration. Yes, birds are sometimes an escape and a deepening of my tie to some better life. They are, as Sister Rachel Carson explained, our neighbors in common environmental plight. Sister Angelou knew exactly why the bird behind bars sang so sweetly. I feel the convergence coming through my own songs, caught halfway between joy and woe. And so I will watch and revere and write. Watch, revere, write. Loving birds and all they bring to my life. Here in this heart's place where peace need find resting habitat and thriving, I give to you the freedom of a moment's wild escape in some feathered thing. If not seen or heard on your own, perhaps it is in some words written by others, maybe some by me. Watch, revere, write, repeat. Watch, revere, write, repeat. I will write in this avicentric worship towards the greater range expansion of love and of inclusion. This writing of and for and to birds, then, of how they make my disparate pieces whole, of how they can stitch together the torn apart and ripped asunder, and revive the dying spirit too. Bring true Emily's equation of hope and feathers. This work will be then from here on my driven mission. Watch, revere, write, repeat. So that's a relatively small part of this larger declaration, but it is it's a piece that I actually wrote back in the old days, if you can remember, waiting at an airport gate through numerous delays. I got a lot of writing done then. I learned after the inevitable delays that seemed to dog me as a traveler, I learned to use that time wisely. And so airports became an important venue for me to write, sort of unencumbered, really, to write without the ability to go do some chore or to be distracted by something else. And so that's a declaration that I owe in part to the inefficiency of American Airlines. Thank you, American. So with the time that's remaining, I want to leave some time for questions, hopefully from you. But I also wanted to leave you with this last thing, because one of the questions that I get, and that many of you have asked, and I've heard it asked of many writers, is, well, you know, how do you find joy in this time? How do you um, how do you celebrate the beauty that you see? You seem to always be writing, and one of the criticisms that I got from this last essay was that, you know, that I'm churning up foment by talking about race. So um, again, it's part of my axis, and when racism stops, I'll stop talking about it. I would gladly just write about the plumages of birds and not the skin color of human beings, if we could get to that point. But until then, I will continue to do so. But I do find joy, and I find joy in birds, but I again find joy in these connections, and thinking about sort of where I would like to see personally for the world to be. So I'll share this last piece that came from a quote that I think I dropped um, on Being. So it's called Joy is the Justice We Give Ourselves. Joy is the justice we give ourselves. It is Maya's caged bird singing beyond the bars, holding its spirit imprisoned without due process or just cause. Joy is Martin's Alabama molehills and unmarred stone mountains flowing fresh to all with crystal clear equality, spring cool to slake the thirst for right. Joy is straightening out that long arc bending towards justice so that it doesn't take so long to reach all of us. Joy is heaven now, no waiting, no dying required. Joy is sunrise on a shell-racked beach at low tide. It is a wedge of wimbrel stitching the icy top of the earth to the low country pluff beneath my feet. Joy is Rachel Spring, riotously unquiet, full of wood thrush song. It is uncountable black beings swirling in murmuration against amber eventide, loved from afar while being hated up close because they are colored darkly as they are. Joy is Professor Carver's sunrise in piney woods. It is he who rides a crazy horse's holy Black Hills ground, absent gods in the images of fallible men, even his own. Praising instead the golden eagle's reign. Joy is Langston's broken wing dreams healed, soaring ever higher in clouded ripples, drifting upwards on verse. Joy is knowing that no means no, no matter what someone else demands. It is believing her because she said it happened. Joy is love unconditioned on hue, or any label you choose. It is cypress swamp so thick with green you cannot see through. Joy is echoes of the Lord God bird and parakeets still careening off the hollows. It is every one of God's million eyes on brown sparrows and brown people too. It is my ancestors shackled ankle and wrist, but hearts never owned, never bound. It is a safe home. It is Terry's refuge. It is a family with open, unjudging arms. Joy is breaths free of chokeholds or blue-clad knees. It is sleep without shots in the dark from which we never wake up. Joy is running without being hunted down. Joy is lost causes buried, never to be found. Joy is not because you said so. It is prairie where cloud and tall grass meet. It is the swallowtail kite's glide from there to here, no permission required. Joy is me. envying every feathered flying thing, surrendering to Toni Morrison's air and riding it. Joy is my grandma's hands throwing grits on the frost-heaved clay for the snowbird she pitied. It is a 40-acre farm. It is half-acre escape, mule negotiable. It is the wayward weed in the sidewalk seam you choose to call a wildflower. It is purpling bruised sky at day's end, wherever the night comes past day. It is tundra swan pointing Harriet to the North Star. It is frogs calling from the same flooded field as last year. It is wild enough to humble us. It is close enough to feel comfortable to one. It is what this world did not give. It is what this world cannot take away. It is what we must sometimes grab, stolen in the fleeting moments between yawning cracks of despair. Joy is salt water rivering in the creases of an upturned smile. Joy can be yours, it can be mine, it can be ours. To notice is requisite prayer. Joy is what we deserve when no one else cares. Joy is all of this, black and brown, plumages of all accounted for. Joy is the justice we give ourselves. So I'd like to thank you. I'd like to thank everyone in Natchez for this wonderful opportunity to speak to you on my process and to share with you just some of maybe the other side that people don't see, maybe beyond home place, which I dearly love to share. But I think that so much of who I am is informed by my poetic side, and it's something that I try to work on daily, and I call it a practice. So I hope that there are questions or comments that are out there. I'm looking forward to saving all of those things so I can check them out, because that's how I become a better writer. So thank you again, Natchez, for your time. Thank you so much for the space for us all, for writers, for poets to communicate our work during these critical times. As I said, I think that it is necessity that words creatively spelled or used rather are air, our water. And so thank you. And I look forward to hearing what's out there. So back to you.
All right, we have a lot of questions, so get ready.
All right.
The first one, a writer writes in that I imagine the field of ornithology to be very white. How has the acceptance been in that community?
Overwhelmingly positive. Yeah, it's yeah, overwhelmingly white. I won't have to quote numbers, but yeah, we there, in terms of trained ornithologists, those people out there with degrees that would give them, that sort of space, that cred to call themselves trained ornithologists. I know most of them, sadly, and it doesn't take two hands to count them all. So at least in North America, right? So and that's Black ornithologists. Now there are brown ornithologists and ornithologists of other ethnicities, I'm sure. But yeah, it's a pretty narrow field. But for the most part, among my colleagues, it's been really good, and people accepting of these messages that it needs to get better, that we need to hear other voices. So I've been heartened by that.
Good, good. Next question. A writer asks, you have a short film project called Rules for the Black Birder. Could you explain the importance of this piece and what inspired you to create it?
Well, that 9 Rules for the Black Birder was first, Orion first published the first one, 9 Rules, back in 2013. And that was unfortunately inspired by the murder of Trayvon Martin. And you notice that one of those rules is never wearing a hoodie. And so that's the Trayvon Martin birding rule. And a satirical piece, but written very quickly. I got a call from the poetry editor at Orion at the time who wanted to know if I had anything in mind. And I sat down, and a couple of hours later, at most, I had it. And I had written more than 9 rules, let me tell you, because I had lived all of those rules, right? And so, and then an organization called Bird Note out in the Pacific Northwest had the courage to pay for it to be made into the film, and that went viral. So it gave me a lot of leverage as a writer and a creator, and that's one of the things I love. And I have several projects now where we're looking at taking stories and moving them. I've had them move to animation, for example, or to film shorts. And it's important for us to get our words out there any way that we can. The latest piece, 9 Rules for the Woke Bird Watcher, was inspired by the murder of Ahmaud Arbery. And I wish that I didn't have to be inspired by such things. Like I said, I feel compelled to write towards these things because they keep happening. Once they stop, and it's sort of my way of protest, that to put this out there so that people say, oh, you love birds. Do you mean you experience racism too? Yes. So all you have to do is look at my friend Christian Cooper, for example, in Central Park. And I tell people who frequently will ask me, well, how do you live down there in the South? Well, how do you bird watch in a place where somebody's going to call the police on you in Central Park? It's everywhere, right? And so it's an opportunity to teach, hopefully, or at the very least to let people know how I feel. People have different opinions on this stuff. They can take it or leave it. I just happen to think racism is wrong.
What drove you from the scientific into the literary?
Well, I like to say I never left the scientific, but part of it as a teacher was, you get up in front of a class of students and you're throwing out all these facts about everything falling down around us. And you're looking at these students and you're looking at their eyes. And it's like I probably looked when my grandmother first was reading Revelations to me. It scared the bejesus out of me. Yeah. Because she was constantly talking about these 4 horsemen. She was talking about, she would take me outside and tell me to look at the blood dripping off of the moon and all of that, right? And it was the end of the world. For my grandmother, the judgment day was coming any day. And that scared me. And I realized that standing in front of my students, I was doing the same thing. And so the science, I don't dismiss at all, but people need to understand that messages come in different ways. And so I want to those students to know the science and to do the best they can by the science. But then I also want them to understand why they get into this field, that it's not to make a bunch of money, that, you're living in a world of woe. How do you heal that world? And part of healing the world sometimes happens with words, to give people inspiration to go on, persistence, right? That we've got to persist through bad times to get to better times. That's all I want to do. So I'm still a scientist. And I call science the scripture, but I think that the scripture has to get outside of the walls of the church house in order to have true application to life.
Well, this is a good follow-up question to your response there. The poet Amanda Gorman looked like a beautiful goldfinch reading her poem at President Biden's inauguration. How can educators introduce students to more poetry? And do you share poetry with your science classes?
Oh, well, yeah, I make my students write poetry. I make them write haiku about birds, because 17 syllables helps a student really, I think, focus on the essentials that help them identify the bird. The way that my students see a lot of poetry is, quite frankly, have them open YouTube. They may not have thick tomes of poetry, but what they do is they're always on YouTube, and there's so much spoken word out there. That's the way a lot of people are getting their poetry. They're not necessarily reading it. They may hear it first, and then they'll say, oh, I like that. Let me go buy that book. So we have to bring ourselves to where the students are finding their information. When we do that, that gives us the ability, you know, that old cliche of meeting people where they are. Well, sometimes that's not good enough. If you meet people where they are, that's only halfway. If you're going to be fully committed, sometimes you got to go where they are, right?
Right.
And that's, you know, that's kind of like that's like old school missionary work. You got to go where people are, but then you don't go there preaching to them. You go there, sit, and you listen, and they will tell you what they like and want to hear. And then you can begin to negotiate about how you learn and that kind of thing.
We have an interesting comment from one listener today. She said, your recitation makes me reflect on Maya Angelou and Paul Laurence Dunbar's struggling bird analogies. How do you feel about that?
I'm flattered. Please save that comment for me.
Okay.
Because to sit in between Paul Laurence Dunbar and Maya Angelou, I mean, it doesn't get any better than that. I'll nest there all day.
Wonderful. One last question. What is the African American response to your work in general?
Very positive. Sometimes it's hard to tell. Certainly, people give you feedback, and sometimes they explicitly say, I'm white, I'm black, I'm brown, or whatever. But it's been overwhelmingly positive from people that I hear from. It's interesting. Again, this last article that I wrote on Audubon, it's really pointing out how uncomfortable some people are with having heroes sort of deconstructed. But as I go along and as I bring people, like I just wrote this imaginary letter that you can find in Emergence magazine. I wrote a letter between Rachel Carson, the white female environmentalist, founder of the environmentalist movement, really, and Martin Luther King Jr. Those two people never met, but I crafted a set of letters between them that sort of based upon God's eye being on the sparrow. So that piece has been well received internationally. So I hope that my writing, even though I color it through the prism of my brown skin, my black being, my hope is that people find some application in it for just being human.
Yes. Well, I think that's all of the questions. I'm going to turn the program over to Emily now.
Thank you very, very much. Thank you.
Thank you. That was awesome, Drew. I'm really glad to hear that you have a new book coming out. Did you say in the spring?
Yeah, March 21st, it'll be Sparrow Envy, Field Guide to Birds and Lesser Beasts through Hub City Press. So it's available now for pre-order through Hub City. Try to go through your local booksellers if you can. There's this big conglomerate out there that you can buy it through. But try to patronize your local bookseller first, and they can get it. But I also am working on the bigger book, which is called Range Maps, Birds, Blackness, and Loving Nature Between the Two. And that is with Farrar, Straus, and Giroux. And hopefully that'll be out about a year and a half from now.
Great. And I'll take this moment to plug the Conundrum bookstore in St. Francisville, which I think everybody knows usually does our on-site bookstore. And she's got books from all of our authors. So if you can't go to St. Francisville and visit them, you can always check her out online. Drew, thank you so much for being here. Betty Jo, thank you for facilitating and moderating today. Do you want to let people know, Drew, like how to follow you on like Twitter or Instagram, any of that kind of thing?
Yes, on Twitter and Instagram, I'm at Wild and in Color, one word, WILDANDINCOLOR, at Wild and in Color. That's where you can find me on Instagram and Twitter. And you can also find me on Facebook, where I dump a lot of stuff at J. Drew Lanham. So I look forward to hearing from folks. And again, thank you guys so much for this space. I really appreciate it.
Well, we were honored to have you, and we want to make sure everybody remembers that we've got a couple more presentations tomorrow, and we appreciate everybody tuning in today and sticking with us through this week, and we will see y'all soon. Thank you.
Bye.
Take care, everyone. Stay safe.
You too. Thank you.
Bye-bye.